She was a very caring person. She was lovable, she was open, she was very open, and she was very giving.
It was supposed to be a day of closure, a moment when a mother of 7 would finally break free from a marriage that had become unbearable. August 4th, 2023, was marked on the calendar as the day she would stand in court, finalize her divorce, and take the first step toward rebuilding her life. Instead, it became the day she took her last breath. At exactly 7:53 in the morning, a call came in to Detroit's emergency dispatch. A woman was down, unresponsive, blood pooling beneath her in the middle of a construction site. A man stood over her, a handgun in his grip, the acrid scent of gunpowder still lingering in the air. When officers arrived, they found the victim motionless, her body riddled with bullets, her final moments spent in terror, trying to outrun the very person she once loved. The man beside her didn't run, he didn't try to hide, he simply stood there, as if everything had already been decided. What led to this? What happened in the hours leading up to that tragic morning? How does a marriage of 13 years end with gunfire on the streets? And most importantly, what signs were missed? This is the story of Endrika McIntosh, a woman who wanted nothing more than to start over, a mother whose life was stolen just as she reached for freedom. 35-year-old Endrika McIntosh was more than a headline, more than a crime scene, more than a statistic in an ever-growing list of domestic violence cases. She was a woman who fought for her family, a mother who poured every ounce of her being into raising her children. She had dreams, ambitions, and a future she desperately wanted to reclaim. But in the end, none of that would matter, not to the man who was supposed to love and protect her. Born and raised in Mount Clemens, Michigan, Endrika's life was shaped by responsibility from a young age. She was the kind of person who didn't just take care of herself, she took care of others. Friends described her as warm-hearted, someone who could light up a room with her smile, but beneath that she carried burdens that few people saw. Life had never been easy, but she never complained. She worked, she endured, and most of all she loved, deeply, fully, sometimes at a cost. Motherhood was her greatest pride. 7 children depended on her, plus an adopted nephew with special needs. It wasn't just a role she played, it was the core of who she was. Her social media was filled with moments of laughter, trips to the park, playful videos with her kids. She showed up for them in ways that went beyond just providing food and shelter. She wanted them to feel loved, to feel safe, to know they had someone who would always fight for them. But what happens when the one thing she couldn't fight against was the man who stood beside her? Balancing work and family was never easy, but Endrika never shied away from hard work. She held multiple jobs, moving from Amazon to the United States Postal Service, then Family Dollar. Recently, she had landed a position with the Transportation Security Administration, a job that symbolized stability, a fresh start. She was excited, proud of where she was headed. She even took her kids to TSA Family Days, hoping to show them that their mother was building something new, something better. But no one knew just how much she was struggling behind closed doors. For 13 years, she had been married to Briome McIntosh, a security officer who took his job seriously. At first glance, they seemed like any other couple. Photos of them at the beach, anniversary posts celebrating their love. In the beginning, there was happiness, there was companionship. She wrote long, heartfelt messages about how much she loved him, how he was the man she had prayed for, but love alone was never enough. At some point, things started to change. She didn't talk about it openly, but the signs were there, buried in her social media posts, hidden in the way her words began to shift. She started sharing cryptic messages about betrayal, about self-worth, about learning to let go. That person left you high and dry. That person is having sex with someone else. You want that person back after they have been with someone else? Where's your self-value? Her posts, once filled with love and devotion, had turned into quiet warnings, pleas for strength, for clarity, for escape. But even as she tried to convince herself to leave, to move on, she knew how dangerous that decision could be. How many times had she thought about walking away before? How many times had she told herself that this time would be different, only to stay because it was easier, because she had children to think about, because she wasn't ready for the war that would come with leaving? Because that's the thing about abusive relationships, leaving isn't just an act of willpower, it's an act of survival, and sometimes survival comes at a cost. By the summer of 2023, Endrika had made her decision. The divorce was filed, the court date was set. August 4th would be the day she officially cut ties, the day she reclaimed her life. But she never made it to that courtroom. She had woken up that morning knowing that by the end of the day she would no longer be a McIntosh. She would no longer be his wife. But did she know that decision would cost her everything? She was home, preparing for what was supposed to be a defining moment in her life when Brian walked in. He had come straight from work. He wasn't supposed to be there. The conversation between them quickly escalated into an argument. A threat was made. Andrika didn't wait to see what he meant by it. She ran. What went through her mind in those final moments? Did she believe she would make it? That if she could just get far enough away, just reach another door, another person, another moment of safety, she would be okay? She called 911 as she sprinted down the street, her breath heavy, her feet pounding against the pavement. She needed help. Someone had to come. Someone had to stop him. But seconds mattered. By the time officers arrived, it was too late. Brian had caught up to her. He had her right where he wanted her, and as she lay on the ground, defenseless, he stood over her and emptied his clip. 7 bullets. 7 children left without a mother. What makes a man snap like that? Was this premeditated? Had he already decided long before that morning that if he couldn't have her, no one else would? The answer to that would soon unfold in the courtroom. But for now, the only thing that mattered was that Andrika was gone. Her children were left to wake up to a world where their mother would never come home again. Her name would become another statistic in the long, growing list of domestic violence homicide. And the man who once claimed to love her, the father of her children, the person she spent 13 years of her life with, was now sitting in handcuffs. But how did we get here? What warning signs were missed? And most importantly, could this murder have been prevented? The morning of August 4th, 2023, started like any other for most people. But for Andrika McIntosh, it was supposed to be the beginning of a new life, a fresh start. In just a few hours, she was scheduled to be in court, where she would finally sever the last ties to a marriage that had become unbearable. She had made up her mind there was no going back. But what she didn't know was that her estranged husband, Brian McIntosh, had made up his mind too, and his decision was far more final. It was just past 7 in the morning when Brian walked into her home. He had finished his overnight shift as a security officer. He shouldn't have been there. Andrika was alone, getting ready to leave when he arrived. Maybe she wasn't surprised to see him. Maybe she had come to expect these unwanted confrontations in the days leading up to the divorce. But this time, something was different. His presence carried a weight that hadn't been there before, something more than just anger or desperation. The argument started almost immediately. We may never know exactly what was said in those final moments, but what we do know is that something pushed her over the edge. Something terrified her enough to make her run. Andrika didn't wait to see what he would do next. She bolted out the door, barefoot, desperate to get away. Her hands clutched her phone as she dialed 911, her voice shaking as she pleaded for help. She was being chased. She needed someone to come, now. Her feet hit the pavement hard as she ran through the streets near Gunston Street in Detroit. Maybe she thought if she could just reach another house, find someone outside, get to a neighbor, she would be safe. But Brian was right behind her. It was 7:45 in the morning when the first gunshot rang out. The explosion of sound shattered the quiet morning air. One shot, then another, then another. Andrika stumbled. The force of the bullets tore through her, stealing what little strength she had left. Her body collapsed onto the pavement. But he didn't stop. He stood over her, his gun raised, and emptied the clip. The street was silent except for the fading echo of gunfire. 6 shell casings lay scattered around her lifeless body. She was still on the phone with 911 when the last shot was fired. The police were already on their way, but they were too late. When officers arrived just minutes later, they saw Brian standing over her body, the gun still in his hand. He didn't run. He didn't fight. He simply stood there as if everything had already been decided. Officers shouted at him to drop the weapon, and he obeyed without hesitation. There was no struggle, no resistance. It was as if he knew exactly what would come next. Paramedics rushed to the scene, but there was nothing they could do, and Andrika was pronounced dead on the spot. In a matter of minutes, 7 children had lost their mother forever, a woman who had dedicated her life to them, who had done everything she could to give them a better future, was now lying lifeless in the street.
First at 11, deadly domestic violence taking the life of a loving mother just hours before her divorce hearing. Good evening and welcome to 7 Action News at 11. I'm Carolyn Clifford.
And I'm Mike Duffy. Andrika McIntosh was shot and killed outside her home on Detroit's East Side Friday morning. Police say when they arrived, her husband was standing over her with a gun in his hand.
7 Action News reporter Brett Cast is outside the courthouse where the suspect was formally arraigned. Brett?
Well, on Friday morning, Andrika was set to have a court hearing for her divorce, and just hours before, she stopped at home to get a change of clothes. And that's when her then husband, she was trying to leave, allegedly showed up with a gun and killed her.
She just had a heart of gold.
A single tragedy that touches dozens of lives. A mother of 7 killed in the midst of seeking a divorce. The man now charged in her murder is her husband of 13 years.
She just had the biggest heart. And for him to just take her away from us is just, it's just sad.
Before 8 a.m. on Friday, 35-year-old Andrika McIntosh was shot and killed outside her Detroit home on Gunston Street. Police say when they arrived, they found 6 shell casings and her husband, 35-year-old Breon McIntosh, standing over her with a gun. The two shared 6 kids together, including their 13-year-old daughter, Sanaya McIntosh.
The life she had fought so hard to protect was gone. As Breon was placed in handcuffs and led to a police vehicle, there was only one question left to be answered. Was this a crime of passion, or had he always intended to kill her? Because when officers searched his home, they found something chilling, something that would later be used against him in court. And what they found changed everything. When police arrived at the scene on the morning of August 4th, 2023, they weren't responding to a mystery. There was no chase, no hunt for a suspect. The crime had already been committed, and the man responsible was standing right there. Breon McIntosh made no attempt to flee. He didn't run, he didn't hide, he didn't resist. He stood over Andrika's lifeless body, gun still in hand, as if frozen in the moment. The officers moved in quickly, weapons drawn, dropped the gun. The command was sharp, urgent. Breon complied immediately. He let the weapon fall to the pavement and raised his hands. No struggle, no last-minute attempt to escape. It was as if he had already resigned himself to what was coming next. They placed him in handcuffs, his wrist locking behind his back, and led him to the patrol car. His expression was unreadable. No visible signs of remorse, no words of explanation, just silence. Investigators moved swiftly, documenting every detail, every piece of evidence. The handgun Breon had used was retrieved and sent for ballistics testing. Blood pooled beneath Andrika, a stark contrast against the rough pavement of the construction site where she had collapsed. Then came the next step, the autopsy report. The medical examiner confirmed what was already known: multiple gunshot wounds. The fatal shots had been fired from close range, ensuring she wouldn't survive. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't a moment of lost control. It was an execution. As investigators pieced together the timeline, they turned to the 911 call Andrika had made just before she was killed. Her voice was frantic, filled with fear. She was running, begging for help. The dispatcher tried to keep her calm, tried to get a location, but the call ended abruptly, cut short not by silence, but by gunfire. Then came the witness statements. A handful of neighbors had seen Breon chasing her down the street. They saw the moment he raised the gun, the moment he fired, the moment she fell. And then, police made another discovery. Inside Breon's home, what they found shifted the case from a crime of passion to something far more chilling. Investigators uncovered handwritten notes, phrases scribbled down, thoughts that hinted at what was going through his mind before he pulled the trigger. It was clear this wasn't an act of rage in the heat of the moment. It was planned. The evidence was overwhelming. The gun, the shell casings, the 911 call, the eyewitnesses, and now, these notes. Breon McIntosh had every intention of making sure Andrika would never walk away from him. Wayne County Prosecutor Kim Worthy didn't mince words. She called Andrika's murder an egregious example of domestic violence at its worst. She reminded the public of something chilling. The most dangerous time in an abusive relationship is when the victim tries to leave. Andrika knew she was in danger. She had hinted at it on social media, posting cryptic messages about betrayal, about heartbreak, about self-worth. She knew it was time to go. But what she didn't know, what so many victims don't realize, is that leaving is often when the real danger begins. Now Breon was facing the consequences. Charged with premeditated first-degree murder and felony firearm offenses, he was held without bond. He was going to trial. But justice doesn't bring back the dead. It doesn't erase the trauma left behind. 7 children had just lost their mother, and now they were about to face something even more painful. Seeing their father, the man who once tucked them into bed at night, become the very reason they were now orphans. Andrika's family wasn't just mourning her, they were demanding justice. But would justice truly be served, or would the legal system fail her the way it had failed so many others? Because as the courtroom doors prepared to open, one question lingered in the air: would Breon McIntosh pay the ultimate price for what he had done? On the morning of August 14, 2023, exactly 10 days after Andrika McIntosh was gunned down in the street, Breon McIntosh walked into a Detroit courtroom for the first time since his arrest. The man who once called himself a husband and father was now an inmate, wearing an orange jumpsuit, his hands cuffed in front of him as he was led to his seat. The weight of what he had done followed him into that room. The courtroom was packed. Family members, friends, and supporters of Andrika filled the benches, their faces heavy with grief. Her children weren't present. They were still trying to process what had happened, still reeling from the fact that the two people who had raised them were now gone in two completely different ways. The Wayne County Prosecutor's Office wasted no time in laying out the charges. Premeditated first-degree murder, felony firearm possession. If convicted, he faced life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge read the charges aloud, and when asked for his plea, Breon answered in a low, almost emotionless voice. "Not guilty." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Not guilty. The words felt like an insult, a refusal to acknowledge what everyone already knew. The evidence was undeniable. The 911 call, the eyewitnesses, the ballistics report, the notes found in his home. Every detail pointed to a crime that was not spontaneous, not accidental, but deliberate. The state laid out its case in stark detail. The 911 recording played first, the last moments of Andrika's life, captured in real time. Her breathless pleas for help, the sound of her feet pounding the pavement, the gunfire that ended everything. It was painful to listen to. Even the judge seemed to stiffen at the sound of those last desperate seconds. Then came the eyewitness testimonies, neighbors who saw Breon chasing Andrika down the street, who watched as he stood over her body and fired repeatedly. The forensic evidence followed. A medical examiner described the 6 gunshot wounds, explaining how each one tore through vital organs, leaving Andrika no chance of survival. And then the chilling discovery inside Breon's home, a series of handwritten notes where he had scribbled down his thoughts about the divorce. One line stood out more than the rest. "If I can't have her, no one can." It was premeditation, written in his own hand. Breon's attorneys had little room to maneuver. The facts were clear. Instead of denying the killing, they attempted a different strategy. They argued that Breon had been pushed to the edge, that the stress of the divorce, financial struggles, and emotional turmoil had driven him to an unthinkable act. They tried to paint him as a man who lost control rather than one who planned a murder. They brought up his years as a father, his hard-working past, the way he had once been a loving husband, but it wasn't enough. Nothing could justify chasing down the mother of his children and executing her in the street. Then came the voices that would define this trial. Andrika's family. Her sister, barely able to speak through her tears, described the way Andrika had feared for her life in the weeks leading up to the shooting. She read aloud one of Andrika's final Facebook posts, the cryptic messages about betrayal, about learning self-worth, about finally letting go. Her mother, eyes filled with rage and heartbreak, stood before the court and asked a question no one could answer. Why? Why didn't he just let her go? Andrika's 13-year-old daughter Sanya wrote a statement that was read aloud by a family attorney. In it, she described the pain of losing her mother, how she still waited for her phone to ring, still expected to hear her voice. "I don't understand why my mom had to die just because she wanted to leave. She was my best friend, and now I have to live without her for the rest of my life?" It was the kind of testimony that left the entire courtroom in silence. It didn't take long for the jury to deliberate. After just 3 hours, they returned with a unanimous decision. Guilty. Guilty of premeditated first-degree murder. Guilty of felony firearm possession. When the verdict was read, Breon showed no visible reaction. He sat still, staring ahead as if he had accepted his fate long before the trial even began. The judge wasted no time in delivering the sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. A life behind bars in exchange for the life he had stolen. Justice had been served, but justice doesn't bring the dead back. Andrika's children were still left without their mother, the family was still left grieving, and an entire community was left asking the same question: how do we stop this from happening again? Because Andrika wasn't the first woman to be murdered by an abusive partner trying to leave, and if nothing changes, she won't be the last. The story of Andrika McIntosh is not just one woman's tragedy. It is a reflection of a horrifying reality, one that plays out across the world, in homes, in relationships, in places where love should mean safety but instead becomes a silent, inescapable trap. Andrika is gone, but how many others are living her story right now? How many are trying to leave, only to find themselves walking straight into danger? Her case is part of a disturbing pattern. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, more than half of all female homicide victims in the United States are killed by an intimate partner. That means for every 2 women murdered, 1 was taken by someone who once claimed to love her. The FBI's crime statistics paint an even grimmer picture. On average, 3 women are killed by a current or former partner every single day in the U.S. alone. And for victims who try to leave, the danger only intensifies. Prosecutor Kim Worthy called Andrika's murder an egregious example of what happens when a victim tries to leave an abuser, and she was right. Domestic violence experts warn that the moment a victim decides to leave is when they are most at risk of being killed. It's not just about walking away, it's about power and control. Abusers do not see their partners as equals, they see them as possessions. And when that possession tries to escape, the abuser's greatest fear kicks in: losing control. Andrika was on the brink of freedom. Her divorce hearing was just hours away, but Brion refused to let her go. In his mind, she had no right to leave, no right to decide her own fate. If he couldn't have her, no one could. It's a script that has played out in too many lives, too many homes, too many headlines. How many times have we heard neighbors say, "We never saw it coming"? How many times have families been left shattered, wishing they had known the warning signs before it was too late? Andrika knew she was in danger. She didn't say it outright, but the clues were there, in her social media posts, in the subtle shifts in her words, in the way she spoke about her marriage in those final months. Her cryptic messages weren't just about heartbreak. They were about betrayal, fear, self-worth, about finally finding the strength to leave. They were red flags, but like so many victims, she likely felt trapped. Maybe she believed she could handle it. Maybe she thought she could walk away without it escalating. How many others feel the same way? Stories like Andrika's often leave people asking, why didn't she just leave sooner? But that's the wrong question. The real question should be, why wasn't she protected when she tried to leave? Experts emphasize the importance of safety planning for victims of domestic violence. Leaving an abusive relationship isn't as simple as walking out the door. It requires a strategy. Some steps that could save a life include having a safe place to go. Many victims stay because they have nowhere else. Shelters and domestic violence hotlines can help with emergency housing. Never announcing the plan to leave, abusers can become more violent when they sense their control slipping. Experts advise victims to plan their escape in secret. Seeking a protective order, while not foolproof, a restraining order can create a legal barrier and allow law enforcement to step in more quickly. Getting professional help, therapists, social workers, and domestic violence advocates can provide support and guidance. If someone you know is in a relationship that seems controlling, manipulative, or dangerous, don't ignore it. Offer help. Listen without judgment. Give them resources, because waiting until it's too late is not an option. Andrika McIntosh should be here today. She should have been sitting in that courtroom signing the final papers of her divorce, walking out with a future ahead of her. Instead, her 7 children are left without a mother. Her family is left with grief that will never fully heal. And the man who once claimed to love her is now locked behind bars, his life reduced to prison walls and regret. But the cycle continues. There are more Andrikas out there, more women trapped in dangerous relationships, more victims making that final, terrifying decision to leave without knowing if they will live to see tomorrow. If you or someone you know is in a dangerous relationship, seek help. There are resources, there are people willing to help. You don't have to face it alone. Because one more life lost is one too many. Andrika McIntosh's story is one of love, sacrifice, and a fight for freedom that ended in tragedy. It is a reminder that domestic violence is not just a private issue. It is a crisis that steals lives, devastates families, and leaves behind irreversible scars. Her murder wasn't random. It wasn't unpredictable. It followed the same chilling pattern that has claimed the lives of thousands of women before her, a cycle of control, manipulation, and finally violence when the abuser feels their power slipping away. Andrika knew she had to leave. She did everything society tells victims to do. She recognized that her relationship was no longer safe. She made plans to escape. She filed for divorce. And yet, she still didn't make it out alive. This is the reality that so many women face. Leaving isn't just difficult, it can be deadly. Andrika was one of 8 domestic violence homicide victims in Wayne County that year alone, and as heartbreaking as her case is, it won't be the last. More women will try to leave. More will be met with violence. More families will bury their daughters, sisters, mothers, unless something changes. Every story like Andrika's should serve as a wake-up call, a reason to pay attention, a reason to ask questions, a reason to take action before another victim loses their life. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, there are steps you can take. Call for help. There are domestic violence hotlines available 24/7 with professionals who can provide guidance, support, and emergency intervention. Create a safety plan. If leaving is the goal, it must be carefully planned. Have a secure place to go. Never announce the plan to the abuser. Document everything. Keeping a record of threats, incidents, and past abuse can help when seeking legal protection. Seek support. You are not alone. There are survivors, advocates, and organizations ready to help. If you are in immediate danger, call emergency services. Your life is worth more than staying in an unsafe situation. Andrika McIntosh's life was more than how it ended. She was a mother, a provider, a woman who loved deeply and gave everything to her family. She deserved a future. Her children deserved more time with their mother. Her death should not be in vain. It is up to us as a society, as a community, as individuals to recognize the signs, to listen, to step in before it's too late. Andrika is gone, but her story doesn't have to end here. It can serve as a lesson, a warning, and most importantly, a call to action. Now we want to hear from you. What do you think needs to change to protect victims of domestic violence? What are the biggest warning signs that people should look out for? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Let's start a conversation, because awareness saves lives. If you found this story important, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so more cases like Andrika's can be shared. The more people who hear these stories, the greater the chance we can prevent the next tragedy. Thank you for watching. Stay safe, stay aware, and we'll see you in the next video.